Tonight, we sail down the Nile, past quiet waters and ancient stars. This is the story of Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt. You're listening to boring biographies for sleep. Before you drift away, leave a comment with the time you're listening. It's your small mark on this night's journey. Now, let's begin. The year was 69 BCE, and the city of Alexandria shimmered beneath the Mediterranean sun. Its marble streets gleamed. Its harbors thrived with ships from every corner of the ancient world. Here, in a palace that overlooked the sea, a child was born. A girl who would one day hold Egypt's fate in her hands. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philopator, daughter of Ptolemy XII Auletes, the king who loved music, debt, and Rome in equal measure. Cleopatra's bloodline was not Egyptian by birth, but Macedonian Greek, descended from Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt. Foreigners wearing crowns of gold and linen, speaking Greek in a land that spoke in hieroglyphs. But Cleopatra would be different. She would learn the Egyptian tongue, the first of her dynasty known to do so. And through that simple act, she bridged a divide her ancestors had ignored. The palace of her childhood was not one of comfort, but of caution. Power in the Ptolemaic dynasty was never secure. Brothers poisoned brothers. Sisters vanished from sight. A smile could be an alliance. A glance could be betrayal. The young princess learned early that words were sharper than swords, and silence was sometimes the strongest shield. She grew up surrounded by tutors and scrolls, absorbing knowledge as easily as breath. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, politics. Cleopatra studied them all. The Library of Alexandria, with its endless papyrus halls and soft lamplight, became her second home. It was said she could speak to any visitor in their own language. From Hebrew to Aramaic, Median to Latin. Not for vanity, but for diplomacy. Knowledge, she understood, was power that could not be stolen. Her father, Ptolemy XII, ruled a kingdom drowning in debt to Rome. To keep his throne, he borrowed heavily from Roman generals and paid in loyalty. The streets whispered that Egypt's crown was no longer its own. Cleopatra watched her father bow to foreign envoys, and somewhere within her, a quiet resolve began to form. Egypt would not kneel forever. But childhood in a royal court was never peaceful. When her father was briefly overthrown, he fled to Rome for aid. And Cleopatra, not yet 10, saw the palace change hands overnight. In the chaos, she learned her first true lesson in leadership, that loyalty could vanish as quickly as sunlight on the Nile. Years later, her father returned to power with Roman support, but the cost was clear. Egypt's independence had been sold piece by piece. When he died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was just 18. By law and tradition, she was to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a boy of 10. They were wed by royal decree, a marriage of bloodline, not affection. And 2 crowns were placed on 2 uneasy heads. The throne she inherited was one of fragility and unrest. The Nile's floods had failed. Famine shadowed the land, and Rome's shadow grew longer with each passing year. The people looked to their young queen, and though her reign began in uncertainty, there was something about her presence that silenced the room. She spoke softly, but her words carried weight. Even then, she understood what few rulers ever did, that power did not come from armies or gold, but from the illusion of control carefully built, quietly held. In the candlelight of her early reign, the fate of Egypt hung by a thread, and Cleopatra, barely more than a girl, was already learning how to weave. Before she became queen, Cleopatra was a student of the stars. She spent her nights on the palace balcony, scrolls spread around her like petals, her gaze fixed on constellations the ancients believed were gods in disguise. Her tutors spoke of geometry and planets, but Cleopatra listened for something deeper, the quiet order behind the movement of the sky. In the halls of the Library of Alexandria, she was often seen walking alone, her fingers trailing across the papyrus shelves. She studied medicine, politics, languages, and philosophy. But her fascination was always with the unseen, the currents that guided both stars and men. The scholars adored her curiosity. They said she could turn questions into revelations. One astronomer recalled how she asked, "If the stars are constant, why do men chase what they cannot keep?" He had no answer. Cleopatra only smiled and said, "Then perhaps that is what makes us human." These were the quiet years, when her kingdom was still distant and her dreams were still her own. She learned how to speak gently but think sharply, how to see what others missed, and how to move through the world unseen until it was time to be noticed. By the time she turned 16, she was no longer the curious child in the library, but a woman of rare understanding. Her tutors bowed when she entered, could not ignore the strength of her gaze. She had learned from the stars one simple truth, that power is not brightness. It is gravity, the ability to draw others into your orbit without ever seeming to move. When Ptolemy XII died in the spring of 51 BCE, the torches of Alexandria burned all night. The sound of mourning drums echoed through the city, not entirely for the man, but for the uncertainty his death had unleashed. On the marble steps of the royal palace, 2 children were crowned. The elder, Cleopatra, just 18, stood tall and steady. Beside her, her 10-year-old brother and co-ruler, Ptolemy XIII, fidgeted beneath the weight of gold and expectation. By law, they were husband and wife, a royal custom meant to preserve the purity of their bloodline. By truth, they were opponents bound by circumstance. Cleopatra's reign began under a sky thick with debt and tension. The Nile's floods had failed 2 years in a row, leaving fields cracked and empty. Crops withered, granaries emptied, and the people whispered to the gods in vain. Beyond Egypt's borders, the great power of Rome hovered. No longer a distant ally, but a creditor watching its investment closely. The Egyptian throne was both gilded and shackled. Cleopatra inherited her father's obligations, tribute owed to Roman generals, alliances forged in desperation, and a kingdom whose faith in its rulers was thinning like the river's edge. But she was not her father. Where Ptolemy had sought survival through submission, Cleopatra sought strength through intellect. She made herself visible to her people, riding through the streets, attending temples, listening to farmers and priests alike. She was fluent not only in their language, but in their suffering. For the first time in centuries, an Egyptian queen spoke as an Egyptian. Her court was small, but fiercely loyal. She surrounded herself with scholars, scribes, and diplomats, men and women chosen not for birthright, but for brilliance. It was whispered that she slept little, that she read long into the night by the light of oil lamps, studying treaties, tax ledgers, and trade routes. Each day, she learned to rule a kingdom that seemed determined to unravel. But in the shadowed halls of the palace, a different story was unfolding. Behind the young king's throne stood a faction of powerful advisors, led by the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the tutor Theodotus of Chios. They viewed Cleopatra's independence as arrogance, her intelligence as a threat. To them, a woman who ruled without permission was dangerous. They began to whisper against her, to cut off her communications, to strip her name from official decrees. Coins once stamped with her face were minted with her brothers alone. Soon, her access to the treasury was blocked. One by one, her allies vanished, either bribed, exiled, or silenced. By 49 BCE, Cleopatra's power had crumbled. That summer, under the blazing Alexandrian sun, she was forced to flee the palace. She crossed the Nile disguised in plain linen, with only a handful of loyal guards. Her brother's faction seized the throne, and the Queen of Egypt became an exile in her own land. She sought refuge in Thebes, then Syria, where she began to rebuild quietly. There, she gathered what remained of her supporters, merchants, soldiers, and scholars still faithful to her cause. Her charisma, even in exile, was magnetic. Men who met her spoke of her voice, low, melodic, commanding. It was said that when she spoke, she could make a room fall still, not through beauty, but through certainty. She raised an army not through promises of conquest, but through persuasion. A queen's will clothed in logic. She knew Egypt could not survive another civil war, but neither could she reclaim her crown through peace alone. Fate, however, was already shifting in her favor. Across the Mediterranean, Rome itself was at war. The conflict between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had torn the Republic apart. As Pompey fled defeat at Pharsalus, he sought refuge in Egypt, a place still officially allied with Rome and now ruled by the boy king Ptolemy XIII. The year was 48 BCE. The Nile glimmered in the summer heat as Pompey's ship approached the Egyptian coast. But Pothinus and the king's advisors saw an opportunity. They feared that harboring Pompey would anger Caesar, whose victory seemed inevitable. So, they made a decision that would stain their names forever. When Pompey stepped onto Egyptian sand, he was greeted with false smiles. Moments later, he was murdered, his head cut from his body, and presented to Caesar as a gift. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria soon after, the act horrified him. He had come not as conqueror, but as reconciler. And the young king's court, with blood still fresh on its hands, had offended him deeply. Cleopatra saw her moment. Alone, outnumbered, and politically outmaneuvered, she decided to risk everything on a single gesture. Under cover of night, she crossed the Nile again, her small boat gliding silently through the reeds. With her was a single companion, Apollodorus, and a daring plan. Legend says she wrapped herself in a rug, some say a linen sack, and had herself carried through Caesar's camp, as if she were a gift. When the bundle was unrolled before the Roman general, she emerged, disheveled, unarmed, but radiant with confidence. Caesar, who had seen every kind of ambition, was struck silent. The woman before him was not fearful, but deliberate. She spoke of Egypt's plight, of treachery and justice, of loyalty and vision. Her words were measured, her eyes unwavering. In that moment, she did not beg for her throne. She claimed it. Caesar agreed to mediate between the two siblings, but in truth, the decision was already made. He saw in Cleopatra something Rome itself had lost: clarity, purpose, and an unbroken will. Their alliance, both political and personal, would change history. In the months that followed, they would restore her crown, ignite a war, and shape the course of an empire. But that night, as the candles flickered across Caesar's tent, the queen who had been exiled and betrayed had quietly won her first victory. Not with armies, but with presence. The winter that followed was unlike any Egypt had known. The rains came hard, and the winds came cold, as if the gods themselves were testing what remained of human resolve. Rome's civil war had spilled into Alexandria, and the marble city that once shone like a mirror of the sun now echoed with the sound of siege engines and shattering stone. The palace became a fortress. Walls once built for ceremony now held lines of soldiers. Servants became couriers. Courtiers became guards. Every hallway smelled faintly of smoke and salt. The scent of war and the sea entwined. Cleopatra did not flee. Each dawn, she walked the upper terraces, her linen robes snapping in the wind, surveying the harbor below. Roman ships burned on the horizon, and beyond them, the Nile remained calm, as if reminding her that some things endure. She wrote letters to distant allies, offering grain to those who would send reinforcements. She rationed food and ordered that no child in the palace would go hungry before she did. At night, she visited the wounded, not with speeches, but with silence. The kind that lets others rest without fear. Those who saw her during the siege would later say that she moved like a flame in still air, never hurried, never shaken, but always burning with purpose. Caesar, too, fought not only with sword and strategy, but with patience. He fortified the palace walls and sent orders across the harbor. He had known war all his life, but here he learned endurance. Sometimes at dusk, they met in the inner courtyard where the fountains had gone dry. They spoke in low voices about supply routes, but their eyes spoke of something deeper, an unspoken recognition that survival itself was an art. Outside, the city groaned. The once luminous library district caught fire when Roman ships clashed with Egyptian fleets. Flames leapt from pier to pier, and ash fell like black snow across the harbor. Scholars would later argue whether that was the night part of the library of Alexandria burned. The great collection of human knowledge scrolls written by poets, physicians, and philosophers, turning to smoke under a foreign sky. No one could say for certain how much was lost, but Cleopatra, watching from her balcony, understood that something more than paper was dying. The idea that wisdom could outlast power. In the midst of chaos, life went on. Musicians still played faintly in the lower halls to calm the children. Servants lit small lamps at sundown, each one a rebellion against the dark. And when rain finally fell, the fire in the harbor hissed and quieted, as if even the elements had grown tired of fighting. The siege lasted months. Food grew scarce and rumor filled the void. Yet through it all, Cleopatra's composure never cracked. When Caesar's officers advised her to retreat to the countryside, she refused. "Egypt cannot leave Egypt," she said. "If the river stays, so will I." When at last the palace gates opened to peace and Caesar's victory banners rose over the city, the people saw their queen emerge from the smoke, her robes torn, her hair damp with sea wind, but her eyes bright and unbroken. Alexandria was scarred, the harbor littered with burned timbers, the libraries dark and hollow, but the throne still stood, and the woman who sat upon it was no longer merely royal, she was tempered. Caesar looked at her then and said quietly, "You have endured as Egypt does." By remembering that the flood always follows the drought, she smiled a small, weary smile and answered, "Then let the river rise." And Egypt once again had a single ruler. Peace returned like a slow tide, and in that calm, Cleopatra invited Caesar to see Egypt not as a prize, but as a living world. For a brief and brilliant season, the Nile became the quiet center of the world. The war in Alexandria was over, the boy king was gone, and the queen, who had lost everything only a year before now, stood again at the heart of her kingdom, not as a pawn of politics, but as its beating pulse. When Julius Caesar chose to linger in Egypt, he did not do so for conquest or tribute or spectacle. He stayed because of her, and because the river itself seemed to ask him to. Cleopatra invited him to sail south, away from Rome's politics, away from the gossip of generals, into the stillness of her country's soul. It was not a journey of empire, but of revelation. Their royal barge was a palace adrift, its sails crimson, its decks carved with lotus and gold. The Nile, heavy with the scent of papyrus and warm earth, carried them past villages of mud brick and reed, where children waved from the banks and priests lifted palms in blessing. At dawn, the river shone like bronze. By dusk, it was silver. Between those hours, history itself seemed to rest. In each city they visited, Cleopatra became both guide and guardian. At Memphis, she showed Caesar the old capital of the pharaohs, where the gods had first taught men to measure time. At Dendera, she led him through the temple of Hathor, the goddess of joy, and whispered translations of the hieroglyphs, stars, water, music, the language of her ancestors. At Thebes, they walked together among the pillars of Karnak, sunlight pouring through the gaps like divine fire. Caesar, who had known the roar of armies and the marble weight of Rome, fell silent before those stones. He had conquered nations, but here he met eternity. Cleopatra spoke little. She preferred to let the river teach. The Nile, she told him once, never fights its way forward. It moves because the world makes room for it. He looked at her then, truly looked, and realized that he was learning more about power from this quiet woman than from a lifetime of generals. At night, when the crew rested, they sat beneath a canopy of woven linen. The stars glowed brighter here, not scattered, but arranged with purpose. Caesar traced the constellations he knew from Rome. Cleopatra showed him those of Egypt: the ram, the crocodile, the falcon, the lotus blooming at dawn. She spoke of Isis and Osiris, the divine lovers separated by death and made whole through memory. Everything is reborn, she said. The river, the land, even the soul. Caesar smiled, weary, intrigued. He had spent his life believing history moved in a straight line, driven by will. Now, by the Nile, he began to see it moved in circles, patient, infinite, inevitable. Some nights they dined with scholars and priests. Other nights, they spoke only through glances and silence. He would ask her, "What does Egypt want from Rome?" And she would answer softly, "To be left alive." He admired her restraint. He admired that she did not flatter him. And as the voyage continued, admiration began to shift, not to desire, but to understanding. They were both people who had outlived rumor, who had carried ambition past exhaustion. When the moon rose, they would stand together at the prow of the ship, the wind in their hair, the world asleep behind them. She would rest her hand on the rail, tracing the grain of the wood. He would follow her gaze down the river's gleaming path and murmur, "In Rome, men fight for eternity. Here, eternity simply exists," and she would smile, not as a queen, not as a lover, but as one soul recognizing another. By the time they returned to Alexandria, the world seemed smaller. Their voyage had lasted weeks, perhaps months, the days blending into one endless reflection. For Cleopatra, it was more than a royal procession. It was an act of reclamation. Each temple, each village, each prayer whispered by the river's edge reminded her that she was not a figurehead propped by Roman favor, but a living link in the chain of pharaohs stretching back to the gods themselves. For Caesar, it was a revelation that the world was older and wiser than Rome ever imagined. He had come to Egypt seeking loyalty. He left it with something rarer, perspective. And when they reached the delta, where the Nile broke into 7 shining mouths and met the sea, Cleopatra looked out at the horizon and said, "Every empire ends where the water begins." Caesar asked, "Even yours?" She answered, "Especially mine." The river carried them home in silence, the moonlight rippling over the water as if the gods themselves had traced their story there, not in conquest, but in calm. When the river finally gave them back to Alexandria, celebration felt less like a triumph and more like a return. In the spring that followed, the palace bloomed with celebration. Cleopatra sailed the river with Caesar aboard her royal barge, its decks draped in silk, its oars gilded with gold. The people gathered along the riverbanks, cheering the return of their queen. She appeared as Isis reborn, the living goddess of fertility and wisdom, a symbol not of conquest, but of renewal. For Caesar, the voyage was a glimpse into another world, a kingdom where the divine and the mortal coexisted, where power was art and ceremony intertwined. He was captivated by her intellect, by her wit, and by her understanding that leadership was performance as much as policy. Cleopatra, in turn, saw in Caesar not merely a lover, but a force capable of keeping Egypt safe from Rome's greed, at least for a time. In the months that followed, their connection deepened. Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy the 15th Caesar, known as Caesarion, the Little Caesar. His birth united Egypt and Rome in blood, even if the world was not ready to accept it. Cleopatra ruled now with confidence, her court alive with scholars, mathematicians, and astronomers. The economy revived. The Nile once again brimmed with trade. And yet, even in this season of calm, she understood how fragile peace could be. Rome was never far away. Its ambitions reached across the sea like vines. So when Caesar prepared to return to Rome in 46 BCE, Cleopatra followed, not as a subject, but as a sovereign guest. In the marble streets of the Roman capital, her presence caused both fascination and outrage. The senators whispered of her beauty, but it was her mind that unsettled them. Here was a woman who spoke like a ruler, who arrived with her own ships, her own wealth, her own child. Caesar housed her in one of his estates, a subtle act that defied Roman propriety. At public events, he honored her openly. When her golden statue was placed in the temple of Venus Genitrix, it sent a message clear as sunlight. Cleopatra was no foreign mistress. She was a queen. But Rome was a city that could love brilliance only briefly. Whispers turned to envy, envy to conspiracy. Caesar's enemies called him a tyrant, and her a spellcaster, an Eastern temptress who clouded his judgment. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's world cracked like glass. She left Rome in mourning, her child in her arms, her future uncertain once more. The Nile awaited her return, and the next chapter of her story. A new alliance, a new love, and the storm that would decide the fate of empires. The news of Julius Caesar's death reached Alexandria like the echo of thunder over calm water. Cleopatra was aboard her royal barge when the messenger arrived, his voice trembling as he spoke the words that would change her life once again. Caesar was gone. The man who had restored her throne, the father of her son, had fallen not on a battlefield, but beneath the knives of his own countrymen. The queen who once ruled beside the conqueror of the world now faced that world alone. She returned to Egypt in mourning, yet she did not crumble. In grief, Cleopatra found clarity. She understood what Rome had failed to see, that empires do not fall through war alone, but through the blindness of those who believe they own them. The death of Caesar left Rome fractured once again. His allies divided, his enemies plotting, the Republic teetering between chaos and renewal. And in that uncertainty, Cleopatra found her purpose. She ruled not as a widow, but as Pharaoh of Egypt, sovereign and divine. Her image shifted, no longer the lover of Caesar, but the living goddess Isis, mother of the new Horus, the protector of Egypt's spirit. She wore the serpent crown of the pharaohs with poise and conviction. Her portraits on coins showed a firm jaw, a regal gaze, not beauty in the modern sense, but presence. Those who met her described her not by her looks, but by her voice. Low, musical, intelligent, magnetic. She could charm a room, disarm an enemy, and command silence with a single word. Under her rule, Alexandria flourished. The city that had nearly burned now bloomed once again, its streets alive with merchants, scholars, and artisans. She reopened the schools, funded the temples, and strengthened the ports that linked Egypt to the world. Trade flowed down the Nile like lifeblood. From Nubia came gold and ivory. From India, spices and silk. The markets rang with the sounds of 100 tongues, and through it all, Cleopatra's seal marked every contract, every coin. She invested in agriculture, restoring irrigation systems neglected by war. When the Nile's floods returned, its waters carried not despair, but prosperity. In the temples, priests praised her as Isis incarnate, the mother who brings life where there was drought. Even Rome, for all its arrogance, had to acknowledge her stability and strength. But power never rests. In Rome, a new struggle began. Between Mark Antony and Octavian, the two men who claimed Caesar's legacy. Cleopatra watched from across the sea, weighing each side with care. She knew that Egypt's survival would depend on choosing wisely. For a time, she remained neutral. She corresponded with both, offering ships, grain, and counsel, but pledging to neither. Then, in 41 BCE, the summons came. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's greatest generals, the hero of Rome's eastern campaigns, requested her presence in Tarsus, a port city in modern-day Turkey. It was a test. He wished to know whether the Queen of Egypt was an ally or rival. Cleopatra understood that this meeting would decide the fate of her kingdom, so she prepared not as a supplicant, but as a spectacle. The day she arrived in Tarsus, the river shone with gold. Her ship sailed beneath crimson sails, its oars flashing silver in the sunlight. Perfumed smoke drifted across the water. Musicians played soft flutes and harps, their melodies curling through the air like a dream. Cleopatra herself reclined beneath a golden canopy, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, while attendants, dressed as cupids, fanned her with peacock feathers. The scent of myrrh filled the air. Citizens of Tarsus lined the shores in awe, believing that the goddess of love herself had descended upon the river. When Mark Antony came aboard, he was not met by a queen, but by an idea, a living embodiment of power, grace, and command. He laughed when they first spoke, but later confessed to his generals that she had conquered him. Before he had uttered a word, In Cleopatra, Antony found what Rome could not give him: freedom, intellect, and equal company. In Antony, Cleopatra found what she needed most: strength and the protection of Rome's finest commander. Together, they began a partnership that would reshape the world once more. Their union was not born merely of romance, but of strategy. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his campaigns. Cleopatra needed Rome's favor to protect her son's throne. But in time, strategy gave way to affection, and affection to devotion. They spent months together in Alexandria, feasting, studying, playing games of wit late into the night. They called themselves the inimitable livers, companions who would live life to its fullest as gods might without apology. To her people, Cleopatra remained divine. To Antony, she was human, brilliant, fierce, and alive. And together, they became the most powerful couple of the ancient world. But beyond the laughter and the luxury, the storm was gathering. In Rome, Octavian watched their union with unease. To him, Cleopatra was not a queen, but a threat. A foreign ruler who had bewitched one of Rome's greatest generals. Soon, their love would ignite a war that neither empire could escape. In Alexandria, the great palace was alive with preparations, ships being built, soldiers being trained. Cleopatra and Antony combined their resources. Egypt's gold, grain, and fleet joined Rome's legions in a single fragile alliance. They held a ceremony in the Egyptian style, a gesture both symbolic and provocative, and named their children with divine titles. Alexander Helios, the sun Cleopatra Selene, the moon and Ptolemy Philadelphus, the loving brother. Together, they envisioned not just love, but empire, a new dynasty, a rebirth of Alexander's dream. Rome and Egypt, united east and west, balanced under their rule. But Octavian saw blasphemy, not balance. He declared Antony's will before the Roman Senate, exposing that Antony intended to grant territories to Cleopatra's children. The outrage was swift. The Senate named war not against Antony, but against Cleopatra of Egypt, the foreign queen who, they claimed, had stolen Rome's honor. The world watched as two civilizations drifted toward their reckoning. Antony and Cleopatra sailed from Alexandria with a vast fleet, over 200 ships gleaming under the sun. Their banners bore Egyptian gold and Roman crimson, a union of two powers that had never before stood as equals. Their destination, the coast of Greece and the narrow bay of Actium. For weeks, their fleets circled one another across the turquoise waters. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, played a war of patience. He cut off their supply lines, harried their ships, waited for exhaustion to do what battle could not. Cleopatra commanded her own Egyptian squadron, ships fitted for speed, their sails perfumed with incense. From her flagship, she watched the horizon burn with sunlight and smoke. Antony's men were loyal, but weary. Disease spread, rations dwindled, and the morale that once glimmered like armor began to crack. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BCE, the sea turned to silver. The wind was calm, Both fleets prepared for what would become the final war of the ancient world. The battle began in thunder. The crash of oars, the shatter of wood and flame. The water ran red with reflection and ruin. Antony fought with ferocity, his ship pressing forward through the chaos. Cleopatra's fleet held formation until, seeing the battle lost, she made a fateful decision. She turned her ships and broke from the line, sailing for the open sea. To this day, historians debate her intent. Was it retreat or strategy to preserve what remained? All that is certain is what followed. Antony, seeing her sails vanish into the horizon, abandoned the fight and followed her. The men who remained saw their leader flee and surrendered soon after. Actium was lost. They returned to Alexandria defeated, but Cleopatra refused to spare. Even in ruin, she prepared her city for the inevitable. The streets filled with soldiers, the palaces with silence. She ordered her treasury secured, her ships repaired. To her people, she remained unshaken. The queen who smiled even as the empire closed around her. Antony, however, was a shadow of the man he once was. The laughter that had once filled the halls turned to silence. He wandered the palace gardens, haunted by ghosts of glory. For a brief time, they tried to live as before. Dinners, music, the illusion of control. But both knew the truth. Rome was coming. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces reached Egypt. The gates of Alexandria opened not in battle, but in exhaustion. The city that had once been the heart of the world now waited for its conqueror. As Octavian's army approached, Cleopatra took refuge in her mausoleum, a grand marble chamber she had built herself, filled with gold, jewels, and scrolls. A monument both to life and to what must follow it. Antony, misled by false news that Cleopatra had taken her own life, fell upon his sword. When word reached her that he still breathed, she ordered he be brought to her side. He died in her arms, the two lovers surrounded by the fragrance of myrrh and smoke. Outside, the world turned to silence. There was a time, just before the end, when Alexandria shone brighter than ever. The city was alive with music and laughter. Golden torches lined the palace steps. Cleopatra and Antony hosted feasts that lasted until dawn, not out of indulgence, but as if trying to hold off the darkness by sheer joy. They dined beneath silk canopies, drank wine from crystal goblets, and discussed philosophy with poets and scholars. Sometimes they would disguise themselves and walk through the city at night, listening to their people, learning what Rome never understood, that a ruler who listens rules twice. They played at being gods, calling themselves Isis and Dionysus, but their laughter carried something wistful, an awareness that divinity was fleeting. Between the songs and the celebrations, Cleopatra sometimes stood at the window, watching the moonlight ripple on the sea. She would say softly, "The brighter the flame, the shorter its life." Antony would take her hand, and together they would fall silent, listening to the waves and to the ticking of time beneath their hearts. These were their last golden days, beautiful, fragile, already fading into memory. The city of Alexandria was quiet when the end came. The air hung still over the harbor, the sails unmoving, the people waiting for word they already feared to hear. Rome had won. Cleopatra withdrew to her mausoleum, a palace of marble and gold she had built for eternity. It was both sanctuary and tomb, its doors sealed from within, its walls lined with treasures meant to outlast dynasties. Outside, Octavian's legions stood at the gates. Inside, the Queen of Egypt prepared for her final act. She was 39 years old. Once the most powerful woman in the world, now cornered by a man who ruled through patience and paperwork. Yet even in defeat, she remained composed. She met Octavian's messengers draped in linen and gold, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering. To the conqueror of the world, she bowed only in ceremony. To herself, she bowed to no one. She knew what Rome would do to her. She had seen it before. Kings paraded in chains, their dignity stripped, their kingdoms mocked in marble streets. She would not give Octavian that triumph. She told her attendants, "I will not be displayed in a Roman triumph." Her tone was not defiant, but peaceful, as though she were discussing the weather. Octavian, cautious yet curious, visited her under guard. He found her serene. The fire that once defined her had become something quieter, not gone, but contained like the glow of an oil lamp before dawn. She spoke politely, offered gifts, and in her eyes, he mistook acceptance for surrender. But Cleopatra had one final victory left, the victory of choice. In her chambers she dressed in royal white. The crown of Egypt rested once more upon her brow. Around her were two loyal servants, Charmian and Iris, women who had followed her since youth and who would not leave her side now. The air was heavy with perfume, rose, myrrh, and lotus, the scent of ritual and remembrance. Upon a table rested a small woven basket covered in figs. Inside, legend says, waited an asp. Its scales coiled like polished bronze, its fangs filled with sleep. She dismissed the guards. A silence fell over the room. A silence deeper than grief, the kind that belongs only to endings. Cleopatra turned to her attendants and said softly, "This is the way of queens." Then, with steady hands, she lifted the serpent to her skin. A faint mark, a slow exhale, and peace. Her body was found later seated upon her throne, the faintest smile still upon her lips. Charmian, barely alive beside her, adjusted the queen's crown and whispered to the soldiers who entered, "Was this well done?" Then she too fell still. When Octavian arrived, he stood in silence. He had come to claim a prisoner. He found a legend. The woman he sought to parade had written her own ending. He ordered her buried beside Mark Antony, as she had wished. And as their tomb was sealed, the age of pharaohs ended. Egypt bowed to Rome, but its last queen never bowed at all. In the centuries that followed, her story would become legend. To some, she was a seductress, to others, a strategist. But history, in its quietest moments, remembers her as something rarer, a woman who refused to let power define her worth, and who met death not with fear, but with grace. The Nile flowed on. The sands shifted. The marble of her palace crumbled into dust. Yet her name, Cleopatra, still ripples through time like moonlight over the river that once carried her crown. Centuries have drifted by since the last light of Egypt was extinguished. Yet somehow, Cleopatra never truly vanished. Her story still lingers, in the whisper of waves against the Alexandrian coast, in the sand that buries and reveals, in the memory of a woman who refused to be forgotten. She was the last to wear the double crown of Egypt, but her reign extended far beyond its borders. Artists painted her as beauty incarnate. Philosophers studied her as a strategist. Historians debated whether she was sinner or saint lover or leader, goddess or woman. The truth lies somewhere softer. In between all those names, Cleopatra was, above all else, awake. She understood the rhythm of power and the silence beneath it. She spoke to kings as equals, to scholars as peers, to her people as their voice. And when the end came, she met it not with fear, but with understanding. Empires rise, rivers shift, even marble crumbles. But wisdom, grace, and will, they linger quietly like a candle still burning in a room long emptied of noise. Tonight, as the world grows still around you, let her story remind you that even in endings there can be peace. That strength does not always shout. Sometimes it simply remains. You've been listening to boring biographies for sleep. If you're still awake, take a moment to breathe deeply, and before you drift away, comment below what time you're listening tonight. Because your story, too, is part of the night, part of the quiet that connects us across time. Good night. May your dreams be calm and your heart steady, like the Nile beneath the moon.